My nephew took my child's birthday gift and said, "This is way cooler than mine, I'm keeping it." My brother dismissed it, saying, "Let him have it, it's no big deal." I nodded. The following day, his car payment didn't clear because I'd stopped paying it. And then, my nephew tore into my kid's birthday present, looked up with a grin and said it was way better than what he got, so he was keeping it, and my brother backed him up by saying it wasn't a big deal and to let it go, so I just nodded in the moment, and the very next day his car payment mysteriously failed because I stopped covering it. This all happened around my son Ethan's 11th birthday. A day I'd been planning for months because the past year had knocked him around pretty hard with a school change, a broken arm from soccer, and some ugly fallouts with kids he thought were friends, and I wanted this birthday to really feel special, like he was seen and appreciated. I bought him an iPhone 16 Pro, and I know some folks would say that's too much for a kid, but it wasn't about flashing a phone, it was about supporting something he genuinely loves, because Ethan has gotten really into photography, spends hours watching tutorials, edits videos on my laptop, and actually puts in real effort. On top of that, he's the most responsible kid I've ever known, makes his bed without reminders, takes better care of our dog than most adults do their own responsibilities, and hardly ever asks for anything. I wrapped the gift myself and made a game out of it with 3 layers of paper just to mess with him, then finished it off with a blue ribbon since that's his favorite color. We kept the party small with just family there, my parents, my younger sister Abby, and unfortunately my brother Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 13-year-old son Dylan. Mark and I used to be close, but over the years he changed into someone I barely recognized, cocky, lazy in ways that somehow took effort, always talking about being a provider even though he hasn't held a steady job in 3 years. The worst part is how he raises Dylan, or really how he doesn't at all, because that kid walks into every room like he owns it, loud, dismissive, grabbing whatever catches his eye whether it belongs to him or not. I've seen him digging through drawers at my parents' house, and once he even slipped my mom's AirPods into his pocket, which Mark brushed off as curiosity, saying boys are just naturally adventurous. We made it through the food, the cake, and the singing, and Ethan was smiling and polite like he always is, opening gifts one by one, books from Abby, a baseball cap from my dad, and a handmade card from my mom that honestly hit me right in the chest. Then it was time for my gift, and Ethan peeled off the first layer, laughed, kept going, and when he finally saw the Apple logo on the box, he froze for a second with this huge grin, and I could tell he knew exactly what it was. He looked at me, not asking permission, just sharing the moment, but before he could even open it, Dylan rushed in and snatched the box straight out of his hands. No joke, no asking, just announced that it was cooler than what he got last month and that he was keeping it. The room went dead quiet, not awkward quiet but tense, and Ethan just stood there holding torn wrapping paper, looking at me like he wasn't sure what was happening, and then Mark actually laughed and said to let him have it because it wasn't that serious. I stared at him and realized he wasn't kidding at all. He really thought it was funny, and that my kid should just shrug off losing his own birthday present because his cousin felt entitled to it. Abby was watching me closely, and even Sarah looked uncomfortable, but she stayed silent like always. Ethan didn't cry or make a scene, he just nodded when I told him we'd talk later, and that was the end of it right there, at least on the surface. What Mark either forgot or chose to ignore was that for the past 2 years I'd been quietly holding his life together behind the scenes, because ever since he lost his job in 2021, I've been paying his car payment every single month after he begged me not to tell our parents and promised it would only be temporary, which turned into 24 straight payments. The morning after the party, I called the bank and shut it down with no warning, no explanation, and the payment bounced, which was just the first piece to fall. By the time Mark called me later that afternoon, I was already halfway through an email to get my name removed from his credit card account. He started the call with small talk like nothing had happened, mentioning how weird it was that the payment didn't go through and asking if it was delayed, and I let him ramble for a bit, laughing it off like some random glitch, before I finally told him it didn't go through because I stopped paying it. The silence on the other end was loud, like something in his head snapped, and when he asked why in that irritated tone he uses whenever he's inconvenienced, I told him exactly why, that Dylan stole Ethan's birthday gift, and instead of correcting him, he laughed and told me to let it happen. He sighed like I was exhausting him and said it wasn't that serious because it was just a phone, and I reminded him it wasn't just a phone, it was my son's birthday present. He accused me of blowing it out of proportion and said he couldn't believe I'd let a kid's issue ruin everything we'd built as brothers, which actually made me laugh out loud, because what we'd built was me bailing him out for 2 years while he played entrepreneur and posted motivational quotes online. I didn't argue, I didn't explain further, I just hung up. That evening Sarah sent me a long, polite message saying she understood my feelings but money was tight and asking if I could help just for this month until they figured things out. And I told her I was sorry but I couldn't do that, and I left it at that and she never replied. The weekend passed quietly, and I could tell Ethan was more hurt than he let on, even though he told me not to replace the phone and said he'd rather save up and buy one himself someday, which coming from an 11-year-old hit me hard, especially knowing his cousin still throws public fits if his soda has too much ice. Then Monday morning I got a fraud alert from the credit card company, and at first I thought it was spam until I realized it was for that card, the one I co-signed for Mark 3 years ago, the same one he swore would only ever be used for emergencies. It turned out he'd completely maxed out the card and set it to auto-pay the minimum balance from one of his checking accounts, the same account that had just been frozen because he kept overdrafting it, so now that card was bouncing too. I spent the whole morning stuck on the phone with customer service, calmly explaining that I no longer had any financial connection to him at all, and when they asked for paperwork I already had everything ready. It took hours of hold music and transfers, but I finally got a full disassociation approved and made it very clear that if he ever tried to attach my name to anything again, I'd escalate it without hesitation. The blowback came almost immediately. Sarah called me again, and this time she wasn't crying, she was furious, saying I was ripping their family apart, that Mark was humiliated, that he couldn't even afford gas for his car anymore. I asked her where that same outrage had been the day before when Dylan grabbed Ethan's birthday gift, and Mark laughed it off like it meant nothing. She snapped back that it had nothing to do with this, and I told her no, it had everything to do with this. Then Mark texted me saying really over a damn iPhone, and I stared at that message for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed what I already knew, that he truly didn't understand what the problem was. I texted back no over a damn lack of respect, and he never replied, though I knew he eventually would, because the real consequences hadn't even fully landed yet. 3 days went by without a word from him, and then I got a voicemail, not a call, just a message delivered in that fake calm voice he uses when he's trying not to sound desperate. He said he was disappointed in me, accused me of using money as a weapon against family, and then he dropped the line that really made me stop, saying this wasn't how our parents raised us, like every time he gets cornered he hides behind mom and dad as if we grew up in some perfect moral bubble and I'm the one breaking the rules. I didn't respond to him at all because my focus had shifted to Ethan, and even though he wasn't complaining or acting out, I could tell something in him had changed. His backpack sat untouched for 2 days and he didn't take a single photo all week, which might not sound like much unless you know this is the same kid who used to crouch on sidewalks photographing ants just to mess with lighting angles. Then I found out why. Dylan had posted a video online of himself unboxing the iPhone 16 with a caption bragging about finally upgrading and calling it a late birthday flex. Ethan wasn't tagged, but some of his classmates saw it anyway, and apparently one kid even said, "Isn't that the phone your cousin stole?" though Ethan never told me about it. I only learned because his teacher called to let me know he'd had a quiet standoff with another boy, nothing physical, but enough that the counselor had to step in. And that was the moment I knew I was done playing nice. The next morning I texted Sarah and told her Mark needed to call me directly. Not her and definitely not Dylan, just him. When he finally called a few hours later he opened with "What now?" and I told him plainly that I wanted the phone back. He laughed, like full-on laughed, like I just asked for something ridiculous, and said I seriously thought he was going to take a phone away from his kid just because my kid's feelings got hurt. I told him it wasn't about feelings, it was about respect, and he shot back that I was overreacting and needed to grow up, then launched into this rant about how I've always used money to control people like I get some kind of rush from it. I told him he was confusing help with control, that I helped him when he couldn't help himself, and what he was feeling now was simply what it felt like when someone finally stopped enabling him, and then he hung up on me. That night Sarah came to my house, didn't step inside, just stood on the porch holding the phone box, still sealed, and without saying a word she handed it to me and walked away. I called Ethan downstairs and gave him the box, and he didn't say anything either, just nodded and went back up to his room, and about an hour later I heard the familiar sound of the camera shutter again, which felt like the first small crack of light after all that mess, though I knew deep down it wasn't finished. 2 days later Mark completely lost it and posted one of those long self-pitying Facebook rants, never naming names but making it obvious, going on about how some people confuse generosity with power and care more about being right than being decent. His friends piled on, a few cousins chimed in with comments about how cold it was and how some people forget their roots, and that's when I knew exactly what his next move would be. Our parents have a quiet emergency fund that both Mark and I had access to, not a huge amount but enough to matter, and while I'd never touched it, Mark had already dipped into it twice, once after his foreclosure and once when Sarah needed surgery. Apparently, right after returning the phone, he tried to pull from that account again without telling our parents, just put in the request like it was his right, and I only found out because the financial advisor emailed me asking to confirm it. I called my parents immediately, and they were stunned, my dad angry, my mom deeply hurt, and I told them I wasn't asking them to cut him off, just to know what he'd been doing behind their backs. The very next day they removed his access entirely, and Mark didn't realize it until he tried to pull money for his car insurance and the transaction got flagged. That night Sarah called again and I could hear him yelling in the background, and she didn't even ask me anything, just passed along his message that he hoped this was worth it, and I told her to ask her husband because he started it, then hung up. Things stayed quiet until the next family dinner, the one my parents insisted on hosting, one of those forced get-togethers where everyone pretends nothing is wrong to keep up appearances. I didn't want to go, but Ethan said he did, and honestly I wanted Mark to look me in the eye at least once. Abby was already there when we arrived, giving me that look that said she knew something was about to blow before dessert, and Sarah and Dylan were in the living room with Dylan glued to his phone, probably his old one since the iPhone had conveniently disappeared from his social media a few days earlier, and I figured Mark had made him delete the video. Or maybe he thought deleting the posts would somehow make me forget everything that happened, because Mark came in from the kitchen acting like it was any other family dinner and even tried to pull me in for a hug, which I stepped away from and everyone definitely noticed. The meal started off tense and quiet, with my mom asking about school, Abby chatting about some guy she'd been seeing, Ethan answering questions with short one-word replies, and Dylan tossing a green bean at Abby's head like it was no big deal, just the usual family dysfunction playing out. Then my dad, who has never been great at letting silence sit, asked Mark if he'd found a new job yet, and Mark just shrugged and said he'd been focused on building something instead of being someone else's puppet, then added without even looking at me, unlike some people. I took a sip of water and kept my mouth shut while Abby looked at me like she was bracing for impact. Sarah jumped in next, saying she hoped we could all start acting like adults again and leave petty things in the past, and I stayed quiet as she kept talking, saying it had been months of unnecessary tension, even though it had really only been 2 weeks, and that we should all move forward for the kids. That's when I finally spoke and said that moving forward doesn't mean pretending nothing happened, and that set everything off. Mark slammed his fork down, stood up and said he was tired of being treated like the villain, complaining that everyone acted like I was some kind of royalty just because I make more money, and that none of them had any idea what kind of pressure he was under. He turned to my dad and shouted that if I was so perfect, maybe he should ask me why I really had him removed from the account and what I said to the bank behind everyone's back. That's when Ethan stood up and the room went completely still, and he looked Mark straight in the eye and said that he let his kid steal from him, laughed about it, then allowed him to post it online and pretend it was his, embarrassing him in front of his entire class. Mark tried to interrupt, but Ethan cut him off and said the worst part was that he never even apologized, and after that the room went dead quiet. My dad told Mark to sit down, my mom told Sarah to stop talking, Abby just shook her head muttering under her breath, and Dylan, unbelievably, smiled. Then my dad stood up, walked into the den, and came back holding a folder, saying he'd made a decision earlier that week and wanted everyone to hear it together. He opened the folder and handed me a copy of a legal document showing that he and my mom had restructured the emergency fund, splitting it in half, one portion in my name and the other in Abby's, with Mark's name completely removed. I looked up at him as he said they trusted him and he abused that trust, and Mark looked stunned like he'd just been slapped. He turned to my mom, but she wouldn't even look at him, and then he stormed out without saying a word, with Sarah rushing after him, while Dylan lingered just long enough to look at Ethan and say, "Guess you finally got your little toy back," before leaving too. Ethan sat back down, picked up his fork and kept eating like nothing had happened. Later that night Mark did what he always does when he's cornered and went online, this time posting a long dramatic story with screenshots of a car repossession notice, exaggerating details to make himself look like the victim, even implying that I had manipulated our parents into cutting him off. Then, out of nowhere, he posted a fake Cash App screenshot claiming he'd paid me back for everything I'd ever helped him with, and the comments exploded with friends, extended family, and even people from church weighing in, including one lawyer who commented a simple warning about fraud which Abby sent me a screenshot of. Things were unraveling fast, and the fake payment screenshot was such a sloppy attempt at saving face that I almost laughed. especially since he posted it late at night like he always does when he wants to stir things up while pretending he doesn't care. The amount was wrong, the timestamp blurred, and the caption said he'd paid his sister back and now I could stop acting like I owned him, and Abby forwarded it to me asking if I'd seen the circus. I didn't comment because I didn't need to, since the replies did the work for me, with old classmates, former coworkers, cousins, and even Sarah's aunt from Texas praising Mark for being the bigger person. That's when Abby tagged a lawyer friend who replied with a single-line warning that falsifying financial records publicly could count as fraud, and within an hour the post vanished without any apology or correction. By the next morning my mom called me, confused and upset, asking if Mark had really paid me back, and I told her no, that it was just another lie. And without planning to, I finally told her something I'd kept to myself, that 2 years earlier Mark had asked me to co-sign a personal loan and I'd refused because by then I already knew the kind of mess he leaves behind. I told her he'd warned me I'd regret it and accused me of choosing money over family, and now we were exactly where I'd expected, and she didn't say much, but I could hear the realization settle in. A few days later she called again asking me to come to the family Christmas dinner, saying she missed me and that Ethan should be with his cousins, and I told her Ethan had already made his choice to spend Christmas somewhere else this year, just the two of us, not to punish anyone but because I was done forcing myself into spaces out of guilt. I was done sitting at tables with people who smiled to my face while showing disrespect in every other way. Then something else happened that caught me off guard because Mark showed up at my office alone. No Sarah, no Dylan, just him waiting by my car during my lunch break, leaning against the passenger door like he had something important to say. For a moment I thought maybe he'd apologize or at least fake it, but instead he asked if I was really cutting him off completely, then asked if I was happy now and whether I was proud of myself for getting my little win. He said it was low of me to turn our parents against him and accused me of acting like some kind of saint while holding his past over his head for years, and I told him straight that I never held anything over him, I just stopped covering for him. He snapped back that I've always thought I was better than everyone else, and I said no, I just believe I deserve better than being used, and with that he walked away without another word. I honestly thought that might be the last time I'd see him for a long while, but I underestimated how petty he could be. 2 days later a package showed up at our house with no return address, and inside was an old iPhone 6 with a cracked screen, filthy, barely functioning, and taped to it was a piece of notebook paper that read, "Hope this one's more his level." Carter opened the box, looked at the phone, then looked at me, and I took it from him, walked it straight to the trash, and said let him have the last word because that's all he's got left. But even then he still wasn't finished because next came a comment under Carter's Instagram post, just a clown emoji and a thumbs down, and I didn't even need to ask who it was because Carter blocked him immediately and said he was tired of pretending we were family just because people say we are. That night I messaged my parents and told them Carter and I wouldn't be coming for Christmas, that we were flying out on the 23rd to somewhere warm and quiet, and I wasn't asking permission, I just didn't want them waiting on us. Mom called the next morning begging, saying it would tear the family apart if I didn't come and that I was the adult and should be the first to reconcile, and I told her I'd been the adult this entire time. Then she said the thing that finally made everything snap into focus, telling me maybe I should be the bigger person and reach out first, and after a long breath I told her the truth that I'd been the bigger person for years by paying his bills, keeping his secrets, and looking the other way while he raised an entitled kid who humiliated mine, all in the name of peace, but now he's a grown man and he can clean up what he broke himself. We booked our flights that afternoon, and when Christmas came Carter and I were 1,300 miles away on a beach with our feet in the water watching the sunset, and he took more photos that week than he had in months. Troy didn't show up to Christmas either, but that wasn't an olive branch, it was a tantrum, and the silence he left was his way of daring our parents to miss him enough to beg, and this time no one did. Coming home from that trip felt like stepping into a different version of our life, not magically better, just clearer, and Carter unpacked his camera gear before his clothes and was editing photos before I finished sorting the mail, and for the first time in a long while the house didn't feel like something I had to protect, it just felt like ours. 3 days later Mom sent the expected message asking if we could talk in person, so I met her at the usual coffee shop near her place, where she hugged me like everything was normal, sat down and got right to it, saying Christmas hadn't felt the same without us and that she and Dad had talked to Troy and things were calmer now, then asking me to reach out first because someone had to and families don't heal through silence. I asked her what Troy had actually done since Christmas that showed he wanted to make things right, and she hesitated, gave me that familiar mom look that's half disappointment and half forced hope, then said he'd been through a lot, so I reminded her that Carter had too, and she said she knew but that I was the stronger one and could take the first step. I told her I already had when I paid his car payment and the one after that and the one after that, and this wasn't about strength anymore, it was about respect, and after that she just stirred her coffee until it went cold and I left first. A week later Troy messaged Carter with a single line saying sorry things went down like that, you deserved better, and Carter showed it to me and asked what he was even supposed to do with that, and I told him nothing because he wasn't responsible for carrying someone else's apology, so Carter deleted it. The final fallout didn't come directly from Troy but from a cousin who texted me after a backyard cookout to say Troy had been loudly telling people that I'd poisoned Carter against him, manipulated our parents, and built a wall around myself just to feel powerful, still unable to say the word accountability even when drunk, and what surprised me most wasn't that he was still talking, it was how little I cared. I read the message and felt no tightness in my chest, just a dull confirmation that this is who he is and who he chooses to be. And that's when I closed the door for good. I went back through every remaining tie I had to him, the financial advisor, insurance paperwork, even an old shared account my dad had opened years ago to be fair, and I quietly removed my name from anything connected to his, nothing dramatic, just clean and final. A few weeks later Mom tried again, not to force a reunion this time, but to ask how she should handle things going forward, and I told her she was free to love both her kids, but I wouldn't sit at the same table as someone who let their child humiliate mine and laughed about it. And that was my line. She sighed and said she hated the silence between us, and I told her there's a difference between silence and peace, and I finally have the second one. Months went by with no messages and no games, and the distance didn't shrink, it just became normal. And then Carter won a regional photography contest and taped the certificate to the fridge next to a photo he took in Miami of the sunset spilling warm light across the ocean. One morning over breakfast he said the year had been kind of the worst but also kind of not, and I smiled and told him I knew exactly what he meant. We still hear about Troy occasionally through people who don't know the whole story, and some ask if we'll ever fix things, and I always say the same thing, that it's not about fixing anything, it's about choosing what you allow back into your life and what you're finally brave enough to leave out. I chose peace and peace stayed, and sometimes when I drive past the street where Troy and Sarah used to live I wonder if he ever looks back and realizes what he traded for pride. Not just money or a phone but trust, closeness, and a family that once gave him every benefit of the doubt. Carter never asks about him anymore, and I don't bring it up either, not because it hurts but because it finally doesn't.